It was the summer of 1888, and the residents of Englewood, Chicago had something new and exciting to talk about. The young, prosperous, and handsome owner of the neighborhood's local pharmacy, who had only arrived in Illinois 3 years earlier, had just bought the big empty lot on the corner of 63rd and Wallace Street. And since then, the owner, 28-year-old Dr. Henry Holmes, had let his many customers know that he was planning to build a grand hotel on that site, the likes of which this village on the south side of the largest Midwestern city in America had never seen before. But some Englewood residents had their doubts. On their way to or from work that July and August, groups of businessmen in black top hats and starched white collars paused at the huge vacant lot, tut-tutting over the cost of building on such marshy land, while sweat-stained day laborers shook their heads over the challenges of sinking a basement and foundation into that soft and shifting ground. But as Dr. Holmes himself looked at that ugly barren property just across the street from his neat and profitable drugstore, all he felt was thrilled. It was the Gilded Age in America, when captains of industry in Chicago lived in mansions so enormous that they looked like castles, showy and glittering gems spread out along South Prairie Avenue and North Lakeshore Drive. And now, after 3 years of hard work and saving money, Dr. Holmes was sure that building and owning this hotel would be his first big step towards joining the exalted ranks of the city's self-made millionaires. The design for the building had come to Dr. Holmes months earlier, all at once, a complete picture right from the start of how the hotel would look both on the outside and on the inside. It would be 3 stories high, the first floor would house retail shops, he would sell his current drugstore and open a new one inside of his hotel on the first floor, along with a jewelry store, a restaurant, a barbershop, and a business that would sell the huge glass window panes that were in such high demand for the skyscrapers that were going up all over the heart of Chicago. The second and third floors of what Dr. Holmes thought of as his castle would each contain 35 rooms, with the third floor offering suites of rooms for long-term residents. His own office would be located on the second floor, in a corner overlooking the street. His quarters would also include rooms in the basement that he would use for his medical research. From the outside, the hotel would look impressive but ordinary. It was the interior of the hotel that Holmes intended to design in ways that he hoped would startle and delight the people who came to stay. It didn't take long for Dr. Holmes to commit this vision to paper, and by summer of the following year, 1889, he had the hotel blueprints and design finished, and enough money to start hiring construction workers. And just a few months later, on a hot day in July, Dr. Holmes watched with shining eyes from the doorway of his pharmacy as workers sank the first shovel into the wet earth across the street. His hotel project had officially begun. But despite his excitement, it would turn out that both the businessmen who had tut-tutted and shaken their heads over the cost of the project and the day laborers who had shaken their heads over the difficulty of building in marshy ground were right. The construction of Dr. Holmes's hotel would end up dragging for nearly 2 years until 1891, when they actually opened the hotel, but even then it wasn't done. They still had a year or 2 before it was actually finished. But as delayed as the project was, it actually would have taken even longer if Dr. Holmes had not been lucky enough to hire the man who would become not only his trusted construction foreman, but also his close personal friend. That man was Benjamin Pitezel. Benjamin Pitezel had arrived in Chicago from Indiana around the time Dr. Holmes's hotel was starting to be built. Benjamin was a tall, strong, 33-year-old carpenter who made up for his tendency to drink too much by his absolute devotion to his wife Carrie and their 5 children, who ranged in age from a few months old to 14 years old. Benjamin had come to Chicago determined to take any job he could that would provide for his growing family. And as he helped his wife and children off the train into Chicago's Grand Depot, he took special care with his 9-year-old daughter Nellie, who had been born with a clubfoot, a birth defect that twisted her foot out of shape and made it difficult for her to walk. Like so many people arriving in Chicago for the first time, the Pitezel family could hardly believe the noise and crowds and the skyscrapers in the center of the city that towered above the streets like the walls of a canyon. Another thing they couldn't believe was the smell from the huge stockyards in South Chicago. It wasn't just the smell of livestock. It was the stink from the slaughterhouses located along the South Side Railroad that made Chicago the meatpacking capital of the United States and the hog butcher for the world. After getting off the train, the older Pitezel children immediately covered their noses, but Benjamin told them that the smell wouldn't be so bad once they hopped aboard the next train that would take them out to the village of Englewood, where he'd heard that a hotel was going up, and the owner always seemed to need more workers, so maybe there was a job for him. It wasn't hard for Benjamin to go to the construction site and locate Dr. Holmes, who was now spending most of his time feeling frustrated by what he saw as the shoddy work done by many of the men he had hired. But few, if any, of the workers that Dr. Holmes had let go and withheld wages from afterwards ever stuck around to complain about it. In fact, a lot of these fired workers actually felt relieved as soon as they were let go, because there was something truly unsettling about the hotel's very unorthodox design. The outside was like any other hotel at the time, but the inside was unlike anything they had ever been asked to build before. The blueprints called for secret staircases, false walls and ceilings, trap doors, and passageways that dead-ended into doors that when you opened them, you were just looking at a wall, not into a room. The blueprints also showed rooms that had no doors or windows and were only accessible via sliding walls or secret passageways. And other rooms on the blueprints appeared normal, but they were actually padded around the outside with a layer of asbestos that made them soundproof. Inside Dr. Holmes's personal office space, workers were ordered to construct a large walk-in vault with a special room built around the outside of it to ensure that the vault could never be removed from the hotel unless the room itself was dismantled first. After one architect was declared incompetent by Dr. Holmes, he proceeded to walk off the site, wondering whether he'd been asked to build a hotel or a carnival-style funhouse. But anytime questions were raised about Dr. Holmes's design, the doctor would just say, "I gave you the blueprints, please just build my hotel." So on the afternoon that Benjamin Pitezel made his way over to the hotel construction site and found Dr. Holmes, he saw that the doctor was in the middle of an argument with the man that he had hired to build a glass-bending furnace in the basement that would produce the windows he hoped to sell in his retail store on the first level. The doctor was telling the furnace maker that the furnace he had just installed was not reaching high enough temperatures, a charge that the tradesman did not believe was true. After the furnace maker angrily stalked away, Dr. Holmes turned to Benjamin, who had put on his best suit and brushed off his worn top hat in preparation for what he hoped would turn into a job interview, and Dr. Holmes immediately noted the effort that Benjamin had clearly made in his appearance, and he instantly took a liking to the tall carpenter with the well-defined chin. To Dr. Holmes, Benjamin immediately seemed like the kind of person he needed to help guide this gargantuan construction project to the finish line. Someone who really knew carpentry and who could handle themselves in what the doctor had come to feel was an increasingly hostile worksite. By the end of their initial 15-minute conversation, Dr. Holmes had indeed offered Benjamin a job, and he recommended temporary lodgings in Englewood for Benjamin and his family. Within just a few weeks, Benjamin had stepped into a supervisory role at the construction site, and sure enough, under his direction, both the quality and pace of work picked up dramatically. And while this was certainly very exciting for Dr. Holmes, it was nothing compared to the excitement he felt in early 1890 when he realized his investment into this hotel was about to pay off big time. In early 1890, Chicago got the news that they had just been named as the location for the 1893 World's Fair, beating out both New York City and St. Louis, Missouri. Chicago politicians and the team of architects who would design the buildings and exhibits for the extravaganza were already estimating that the massive event would attract at least 25 million visitors to the so-called Windy City, a nickname that Chicago had just earned, not for the cold breeze that blew off of nearby Lake Michigan, but because of all the windy talk by Chicago politicians who had assured the World Fair Selection Committee that their upstart city in the Midwest could throw a party like no one on earth had ever seen before. So, even as Dr. Holmes tallied up the ever-rising costs of building this hotel, he knew as soon as that fair came to town, he was virtually guaranteed to become a very rich man. Because by that time, his hotel would be complete and all those fair attendees would come pouring through his doors looking to rent rooms. In late 1890, about 10 months or so after the announcement of the location of the World's Fair, Ned and Julia Connor were hired by Dr. Holmes to work on the first floor of his nearly completed hotel. Ned was hired to manage the newly opened little jewelry store, and Ned's wife, Julia, had been hired to keep the books in the new drugstore. And if that wasn't good news enough for the couple, the doctor had also offered them, along with their 8-year-old daughter Pearl, free room and board on the second floor of the hotel until the parents earned enough money to buy or rent a place of their own. While Ned was a fairly average man who admired the ambitions of other men more than pursuing any big dreams himself, his wife, Julia, was a 6-foot-tall beauty who was often annoyed by her husband's timidity. Back in Iowa, their lives had been quiet and predictable. Here in Chicago, Julia loved the flow of people into and out of the stores, and she also began to enjoy the attention of the men who were struck by her good looks and small-town naivete. One man in particular, a regular at the hotel who always wore a black bowler hat and who had rooms on the second floor, began spending quite a lot of time in the drugstore, listening very attentively to anything Julia said, and standing very close to her when they talked. Ned was totally oblivious, but his customers were not. They could tell that there was obviously something going on between Ned's wife, Julia, and the man in the bowler hat. A visit from Ned's sister, Gertrude, warmed the increasingly chilly atmosphere that had settled over the room where Ned and Pearl and Julia lived. But not long into what was supposed to be an extended stay, Gertrude suddenly cut her visit short. She didn't give much of an explanation other than to say that she found the hotel very gloomy and strange, and once or twice in the evening she had lost her way in the maze of hallways, and she was certain someone was following her. With Gertrude gone, tensions in the Connor marriage came to a boiling point. Ned didn't know what was wrong with his wife, but it was clear she wanted nothing more to do with him. In the summer of 1891, when he finally threatened to leave her if things did not improve, her answer was immediate and final. Our separation can't happen soon enough. A few months after that, in November of 1891, Julia told the man in the bowler hat, who had gone from just paying close attention to her to sharing her bed, that she was pregnant. The man instantly agreed to marry her, but he had one very specific condition for marriage. Julia agreed to his terms, and after that, they set a date of Christmas Eve to actually perform this very specific thing that the man in the bowler hat required in order to marry her. On Christmas Eve, December 24th, Julia tucked her 8-year-old daughter Pearl into bed. Pearl had missed her father terribly of late, but she was very excited about the presents that might be waiting for her tomorrow under the tree. After Pearl had fallen asleep, Julia left the room and quietly made her way down the dim hotel hallway to a suite of rooms where some of her friends lived. It was Mr. and Mrs. Crow, who were long-term hotel guests. The couple would be leaving the next morning to spend Christmas with their relatives, but Mrs. Crow had invited Julia to decorate a tree in the Crow's apartment for Pearl to enjoy the next day. While they hung ornaments, Julia chatted excitedly about Christmas and about her plans to go to Davenport, Iowa soon with Pearl for the wedding of Julia's older sister. The next morning, Mrs. Crow and her husband got up early and waited by the door patiently for Julia and Pearl to arrive at their apartment. Their plan was to let them in and chat with them for a few minutes and wish them a Merry Christmas before they left for their own Christmas celebration. But Julia and Pearl never arrived, and when Mrs. Crow went down the hallway to knock on Julia's door, there was no answer. Around the same time, while Dr. Holmes was on Christmas vacation himself, he started to receive a number of letters from parents and relatives of women who had vanished. In all of these letters, these heartbroken parents, sisters, and brothers would say that their missing loved one had mentioned being in Englewood, Chicago before they went missing, and so could Dr. Holmes check to see if maybe they were at his hotel or if they had been there recently. Dr. Holmes was alarmed and kind of overwhelmed by these letters, and so he decided to just put them in his desk until he got back to work after the holiday. And when the holiday was over and he did go back to work at the hotel, before he could even begin to dive into these letters, Mrs. Crow approached him and asked him if he knew where his employee, Julia Connor, and her daughter Pearl were, as they still had not been seen or heard from since Christmas Eve. When Dr. Holmes asked his janitor to check on Julia's room, the room looked as though Julia and Pearl had simply gotten up and walked out the door, intending to return at any moment, but obviously they hadn't. As strange as this was, Dr. Holmes knew Julia's marriage had collapsed and that she was trying to plan a trip back to Iowa with her daughter to see family, and so he told Mrs. Crow that Julia and Pearl must have just decided to go to Iowa early. Mrs. Crow was not entirely sold because the whole thing seemed very strange, but she accepted the answer and walked away. After that, Dr. Holmes would spend some time looking into those letters about the other missing women, and he would send some follow-up responses to the family members and friends who had written him, mostly just saying that yes, some of these women had been at his hotel, but he really didn't know what happened to them after they left. Eventually, after looking at so many letters, Dr. Holmes decided that, these missing people were really not his responsibility, and so he kind of just stopped writing back. A few months later, in the spring of 1892, a few weeks before the scheduled start of construction of the Chicago World's Fair, Dr. Holmes hired another bookkeeper to replace Julia, who was still gone. The replacement bookkeeper was a 24-year-old friendly young woman named Emmeline Segrand. She was from Indiana, and she had the lightest color blonde hair Dr. Holmes had ever seen. She was excited at the prospect of working right next to the World's Fair, and she'd brought her life savings with her, $800, which today would be worth more than $26,000. Emmeline rented rooms in a boarding house near the hotel, and it wasn't long after starting her job at the hotel before Emmeline, too, had bumped into the handsome fellow who had earlier won the heart of Julia Connor, the man in the bowler hat. Soon, Emmeline and this man were spending as much time together as they could. Emmeline's handsome suitor taught her how to ride one of the newly designed bicycles that were all the rage, and when Emmeline wasn't working at the hotel, she and the man in the bowler hat, who had quickly become her lover, took long rides along the pathways just outside of Jackson Park, where the fair was slowly being set up. Like hundreds of other residents of neighborhoods near Jackson Park, Emmeline and the man in the bowler hat watched arm in arm as the so-called White City of the Chicago's World Fair began to take shape in front of them. The White City was this huge stretch of land at the center of Jackson Park, where big white stucco buildings were being built to house the fair's thousands of shows and exhibits. That summer, Emmeline's lover had asked her to marry him, and Emmeline hardly waited for him to finish his proposal before she said yes. But by the fall of that year, something had changed inside of Emmeline. She began talking to one of her good friends, her name was Mrs. Lawrence, about her desire to take a trip back to her family in Indiana, and hinting that it likely would be a long visit, that she really needed a break from Englewood. Then, sometime during the first week of December of that year, Emmeline visited Mrs. Lawrence, who lived on the second floor of Dr. Holmes's hotel. But not long after arriving, Emmeline told Mrs. Lawrence that she just hated being in that hotel. It was gloomy and dark and oppressive, and she just hated it. During this visit, Emmeline would also tell Mrs. Lawrence that she was worried about her life savings. She had handed it over to her fiancé, the man in the bowler hat, for safekeeping, as he had suggested. But every time she asked him to return it, he would just kind of blow her off. And as much as it pained her to say this out loud, she could tell his interest in her was also just waning. Before she left, Emmeline would give Mrs. Lawrence a Christmas gift that she had bought for her. Mrs. Lawrence would smile and thank her, and she would tell Emmeline to be sure to come back closer to Christmas because she had a gift for her as well. But shortly after that visit, Emmeline, just like Julia Connor and her daughter Pearl, seemed to have vanished. When Mrs. Lawrence noticed Emmeline's absence, she went to Dr. Holmes's office to see if he knew where she went. And Dr. Holmes, with a slight look of frustration on his face, said that Emmeline had come to him and said she was leaving to get married and go on a honeymoon to Europe, and so he didn't know if she was coming back or not, which meant, once again, Dr. Holmes was without a bookkeeper and would need to hire yet another one. 3 months later, in March of 1893, Dr. Holmes received yet another inquiry about a missing woman, but this time it was about a woman he recognized. The sender was Emmeline Segron's father, asking if Dr. Holmes had information that might help the Segrons find their daughter. Dr. Holmes was surprised and wrote back the same thing he had told Mrs. Lawrence, that Emmeline had left the hotel in December because of her marriage plans. Dr. Holmes suggested that the Segron family contact her other employers and see if maybe they know something, and if they did learn anything about Emmeline's whereabouts, to please contact him and let him know. Emmeline's disappearance put Julia's and Pearl's disappearance in a whole new light for Dr. Holmes. It also made Dr. Holmes look differently at all those letters he had gotten from the family and friends of other missing women in the area. But Dr. Holmes was a busy man, and so not long after writing back to Emmeline's father, he was back focusing on expanding his business empire. An empire that included not only his hotel business, but also his mail order company that sold various ointments and elixirs he developed, including one he claimed cured alcoholism. A few months after Emmeline's father had sent that letter to Dr. Holmes, the World's Fair finally opened its doors. Thousands of people an hour strolled through the gleaming white exhibit halls inside of White City, where visitors from all over the world experienced for the first time things like elevators, moving pictures, voice recordings, Wrigley's chewing gum, Cracker Jack popcorn, and the zipper, which would revolutionize women's fashion. It was the first time people would taste brownies and the sausages that would later become the Chicago-style hot dog. 38,000 people a day rode on the world's first Ferris wheel, which was more than 25 stories tall and equipped with compartments that looked like rail cars and that held up to 60 people each. There was one man in particular who seemed to attend the fair every night, and that was the man in the bowler hat. He was handsome and refined looking, and he smiled at all the ladies, buying them cold dishes of ice cream while they watched the incredibly popular Wild West show put on by the famous frontiersman Wild Bill Cody. This same man who had seduced Julia Connor and Emmeline Segron before they went missing now graciously opened a path in the crowds for the older wealthy women whose families back home didn't expect to see them for days, and who would never know until it was too late that this wealthy mother or grandmother or relative was never going to come home at all. Smiling and attentive, the man in the bowler hat drifted in and out of the pavilions that housed exotic encampments of people from other countries and walked along the lagoons dotted with sailboats powered by brand new electric motors. Some nights, the man in the bowler hat left the fairgrounds alone. But other nights, as he headed toward Dr. Holmes's World Fair Hotel, he would be holding the arm of a woman, leaning over her protectively as the two of them made their way toward the gloomy castle on 63rd and Wallace. By the time the fair ended on October 30th, 1893, Chicago had in fact shown the world that the Windy City could throw the party to end all parties. The fair wound up breaking all sorts of attendance records, with a staggering 27 million people passing through their gates into the White City, which now stood empty and abandoned inside of Jackson Park. But as successful as the fair had been, it also had a dark side. During the fair, 12 firefighters had died trying to put out a blaze that burned down the Hall of Electricity. The mayor of Chicago, who was scheduled to be a part of the fair's closing ceremonies, was assassinated in his home just 2 days prior by a disgruntled and mentally ill voter. And police and private detective agencies were getting flooded with more and more reports of missing men and women, people who had left homes far away to see the wonders of the world at this fair, and then were never seen again. But with a homicide rate of 4 murders a day in Chicago at the time, police were so overwhelmed by violent crimes that only a very small handful of these missing persons reports got any attention. As for Dr. Holmes, the fair had indeed made him a rich man, but it was bittersweet. Julia and her daughter Pearl were still missing, as was Emmeline, and many of the other missing people in the city had stayed at his hotel before they vanished. This, of course, caused Dr. Holmes a considerable amount of distress, but fortunately, during the fair, Dr. Holmes had met someone. And now, when he was with her, whatever stress he had just seemed to melt away. Her name was Georgiana Yoke. She was 23, small, blonde, and had large blue eyes and a sharp mind. Together, they had wandered the fairgrounds, riding the Ferris wheel and quickly falling in love. By the time the fair ended, they had gotten married. And then, not long after that, with his wife's encouragement, Dr. Holmes decided that as much as he wanted to help all of these families and people who kept writing to him about their missing loved ones, he simply couldn't. He didn't have any answers to give them. And so, from then on, he simply began tucking the new letters he would receive every week into his desk drawer, and then he just did his best to keep going forward in his own life, assuming that the police would handle all of these missing people. But, as Dr. Holmes would eventually learn, no matter what he did or where he went, he would forever be tied to those missing people, because before those people vanished, they encountered the monster that roamed the halls of his hotel, the man in the bowler hat. After the World's Fair ended, Dr. Holmes decided he needed to pursue a new business opportunity, and the idea he thought of was one that he had come up with years earlier when he was a medical student at Michigan University. But at the time, for whatever reason, he had just not acted on this idea. The idea was a little complicated, but the payoff could be huge. However, in order to make it work, the doctor needed a very trustworthy partner. So, late in the summer of 1894, roughly 8 months after the World's Fair had ended, Dr. Holmes looked up his good old trusty hotel construction foreman and close friend, Benjamin Pitezel, who was now living in St. Louis with his wife and children. Benjamin's drinking had only gotten worse over the years, and after finishing up the hotel project, he had struggled to make ends meet financially. So, after hearing Dr. Holmes's pitch about this new business idea, even though it required Ben to move away from his wife and kids temporarily to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, something he really didn't want to do, and even though the plan seemed very risky, Ben ultimately agreed to do it. As for Benjamin's wife, Carrie, she was not thrilled at the idea of her husband being gone for an extended period of time, but like her husband, she trusted Dr. Holmes's business instincts. And just the year before, Dr. Holmes had actually paid out of pocket for Ben to get a life insurance policy worth $10,000, which is approximately $350,000 by today's standards. And as morbid as it was, the thought of that life insurance policy eased the anxiety Carrie felt about her husband temporarily relocating. Because if something happened to him, their family would be okay, at least financially. So eventually, Carrie would give the plan her blessing. On the face of it, their plan was simple. Ben would rent office space in Philadelphia and get set up as a patent investor, someone who evaluates the potential success of newly patented inventions and invests money in the ones that look like they have good earning potential. With his knack for gadgets and machinery, all Ben really had to do was identify a couple of good money-making prospects. And then from there, Dr. Holmes would handle the rest. By August of 1894, Benjamin had arrived in Philadelphia and had found a small office with an upstairs set of bedrooms. In the downstairs office window, anyone who was walking by could see a new, neatly lettered sign that read "Patents Bought and Sold." Ben didn't have to wait very long before he had his first customer. It was a young carpenter whose invention for improving the production and quality of handsaws was promising enough that Ben scheduled a second meeting with him for the following week. But when the young man came back the following week to the patent office on Tuesday, September 4th, Benjamin was nowhere to be found. After waiting nearly an hour downstairs, the young man began calling out for Benjamin, but there was no answer. So the young man decided to go investigate. He stood up from the chair he was in and walked around the desk toward the back door of the office that led to a set of creaky stairs. He took those stairs up to the second floor, and as he turned down the short upstairs hallway toward a partially opened door, the young man suddenly stopped. There was this horrible smell in the air. He clapped his hand over his mouth and his nose, and with a terrible sense of dread, he walked forward and then pushed that partially open door all the way open. A minute later, gagging at what he had just seen, the young man was back out on the street. He ran to a nearby drugstore and he told the store owner that something terrible had just happened inside of the new patent investment office a few doors down. A few minutes later, the young man and that shop owner were looking down at the bloated and putrefying corpse of Benjamin Peitzel. Ben was lying on his back on the floor, baking in the hot sunlight that was beating into the room through the glass of the closed window nearby. His hair and part of his face had been badly burned. His tongue was swollen and stuck out of his mouth. Also, draining out of his mouth was a stream of strange-looking red fluid. Just from the looks of it, it seemed fairly obvious that Benjamin had been dead at least for a couple of days. On the floor near Benjamin's body, there was a broken smoking pipe, a match, and a broken glass jar that had contained benzene, a highly flammable liquid that Ben had apparently been mixing with other acids to make a washing powder. An initial investigation by the police determined that Ben had died an accidental death. He must have just been standing too close to the jar of benzene when he struck a match to light his pipe, and then the liquid must have exploded and killed him, burning his face and hair in the process. But based on an examination of Benjamin's body later that afternoon, a very different picture started to emerge about what really happened to Benjamin. And it would turn out what happened to Benjamin had everything to do with the monster inside of Dr. Holmes's hotel, the man in the bowler hat. Based on a series of discoveries that were made following Benjamin's death, this is a reconstruction of what really happened to him and who this monster really was. 2 days before the young man discovered Benjamin's dead body, Benjamin was sitting at the big wooden table in one of the rooms above his patent office. He just received a letter from his wife, Carrie, that said she and their 2-year-old son, Wharton, were sick. Worried, Ben poured himself another glass of whiskey and fiddled absently with his pipe and tobacco pouch. Maybe he should abandon the plan and just go home to St. Louis, at least until Carrie and the children were all healthy again. But just when the whiskey had really started to warm his insides, Ben suddenly heard footsteps on the creaky stairway that led up to the room where he was now sitting. He felt a flash of concern. He wasn't expecting any visitors that day, and whoever had come inside had not rung the bell at the front desk. Getting up from the table, Ben walked unsteadily to the door and peered down the hallway. But who he saw standing there immediately put him at ease. It was the man in the bowler hat. A man Benjamin knew well and had seen many times at Dr. Holmes's hotel in Chicago. But what on earth was the man doing here now? The man in the bowler hat casually slipped right past Ben and settled himself at the wooden table. Without a word, he pulled a brand new pint of whiskey out of a coat pocket and put that down on the table as well. An hour later, just before Ben's eyes closed and his chin dipped to his chest, the man in the bowler hat realized with satisfaction that Ben was very, very drunk. Once he was sure Ben was asleep, the man in the bowler hat pulled a small bottle of chloroform from another coat pocket, along with a big square of clean white cloth. The man tipped the contents of the bottle onto the cloth. Then, standing up and walking over to Ben, the man in the bowler hat pressed the cloth over Ben's mouth and nose. In low doses, chloroform can dull the sensation of pain. In high doses, when inhaled or swallowed, it can be deadly. The man in the bowler hat repeated the sequence several times, gradually upping the amount of chloroform he was administering to his victim. The man did not rush. He enjoyed feeling the slight jerk every time he pressed the cloth against Ben's face. Once the man was sure that Ben was dead, or at least close to it, he pulled Ben's body onto the floor on his back and then poured another 2 ounces of the chloroform straight down Ben's throat, pressing down on Ben's chest at regular intervals to ensure that the drug made its way into Ben's stomach. Once he was satisfied that Ben was dead, the man in the bowler hat carefully arranged the scene so it would look like an accident, and just before he left, he set fire to Ben's hair and coaxed the flame down along the skin of Ben's face. But it would turn out the killer made a huge miscalculation, because the doctors at the morgue who would examine Benjamin's body just hours after it was discovered 2 days later on September 4th, they would find evidence that Ben's death was not an accident. That red fluid they saw draining out of the side of Ben's mouth was apparently a telltale sign that large amounts of chloroform had been forced into his stomach. It would turn out Benjamin was not the man in the bowler hat's first murder victim. Many of the missing people back in Chicago, including Julia Connor, her daughter Pearl, and Emmeline Segrand, whose heartbroken families and friends had written letters to Dr. Holmes asking for his help, had been lured into Dr. Holmes's hotel by this man in the bowler hat, where he would kill them. And to everyone's shock, the man in the bowler hat was none other than Dr. Holmes himself. But as shocking as that was, it was nothing compared to the horrific details of the crimes Dr. Holmes committed. The tip that broke the case wide open and revealed Dr. Holmes's killing spree came from a fellow criminal who had met Dr. Holmes in St. Louis, Missouri. In exchange for the name of a shady attorney who could help Holmes set up the patent office in Philadelphia, Holmes had revealed every detail of the intricate insurance scam he was going to pull off with Benjamin, and he promised this criminal a cut of the profits. According to the plan, Benjamin would arrive in Philadelphia, and once he was all set up as a patent investor, he and Holmes would fake Ben's death and then collect on Ben's life insurance policy, the one that Dr. Holmes had bought for him. And the way they had planned to fake his death was relatively simple. The doctor would substitute a badly decomposed and seemingly unidentifiable dead body from the morgue right in the back of the patent office, and then when the body was discovered, the doctor and Ben's wife Carrie would both claim that the body was that of Benjamin Pitezel. And then the Pitezels and Dr. Holmes would split the huge payout from the life insurance policy 50-50. Except that Dr. Holmes never had any intention of splitting that payout with anyone. Instead, immediately after Dr. Holmes had actually killed his close friend Ben, Dr. Holmes had returned to St. Louis and told Ben's wife Carrie that her husband was alive and well, the plan was going exactly as it should, but Ben would need to stay out of town for a while since people couldn't know he was actually alive. However, Dr. Holmes told Carrie that he knew where Benjamin was and that Benjamin really wanted to see his kids. And so Carrie agreed to let her 13-year-old Alice, 11-year-old Nellie, and 8-year-old Howard go with Dr. Holmes to go see their father for a little while. And Carrie said she would join them all as soon as she and her other kids were well again. In reality, what Dr. Holmes had done was kidnap the 3 Pitezel children. He took them away from their mother so he could hold them hostage while he forced her to give him more and more of her share of the insurance money. On November 17th, 10 weeks after Benjamin's death, Detectives from the famous Pinkerton Private Security and Detective Agency, who had been hired by Philadelphia Fidelity Insurance Company, finally tracked Dr. Holmes down in Boston, Massachusetts. They immediately arrested him, and even though they totally suspected he had killed Benjamin, they didn't have proof, so they could only charge him with fraud, and then they sent him to Philadelphia to stand trial. But it wasn't the fraud charges that would grip the world's attention. It was the fact that 3 of the Pitezel children were still missing, and the last time anyone had seen them, they were with the man suspected of killing their father. And when Dr. Holmes and Ben's wife Carrie both appeared in court in Philadelphia to face these fraud charges, the stricken mother could not have cared less about the money. She had only one question for the police and for Dr. Holmes and for all of America. Where are my children? It was a question that would become banner headlines across the country. It would also become an absolute obsession for one Philadelphia detective named Frank Geyser, who was determined to find the answer. Throughout the summer of 1895, everyone in the country held their breath as they followed the path of Detective Geyser as he crisscrossed the United States and Canada looking for the missing Pitezel children. Using letters that little Alice and Nellie had written to their mother over the weeks they were dragged from place to place by their captor, Dr. Holmes, Detective Geyser would eventually make 3 heartbreaking discoveries. Dr. Holmes, of course, never actually sent these letters the girls had written, in which they had named and described different places they were staying, and they had begged their mother to come get them or at least write back to them. Instead, Dr. Holmes kept their letters in a metal box that police would find among his possessions. On July 15th, buried in the backyard of a charming little house that Dr. Holmes had rented back in October of the previous year, Detective Frank Geyser found the bodies of the 2 Pitezel sisters. Alice and Nellie had been forced by Dr. Holmes to climb inside of a trunk together where they were gassed to death. The doctor then dragged their small bodies outside and tossed them into a shallow grave. Before covering their bodies with earth, Dr. Holmes had cut off Nellie's legs so her body could not be identified by the girl's club foot. It wasn't until weeks later, on August 27th, that Detective Geyser finally succeeded in finding the 3rd missing Pitezel child, 8-year-old Howard. Dr. Holmes had poisoned the little boy, cut his body into pieces, and then burned the pieces inside of a coal stove in another house the doctor had rented in Indiana. Along with a clotted mass of the boy's hair and bones that had gotten caught inside of the stovepipe, Detective Geyser found the little boy's most treasured possession collecting dust in the corner of the living room. It was a brightly colored spinning top with a handle in the shape of a tiny man that Benjamin had bought for his son at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. As news spread about the discovery of the 3 Pitezel children's bodies, Dr. Holmes was finally charged with 4 counts of murder. On July 19th, shortly after the discovery of Alice and Nellie, Chicago police lined up outside of Dr. Holmes's hotel and began a floor-by-floor, room-by-room search of the building. And what they discovered would finally explain why the layout of Dr. Holmes's hotel was so strange. It was because he had literally built the hotel to kill people. The moving doors and dead-end passages were perfect for stalking his disoriented guests, mostly young, vulnerable women and older, wealthy women whom he could rob before killing. After he killed them, he would slip their bodies into an opening in the wall on the 2nd floor that led to a greased chute, and then the bodies would tumble down the chute into the basement where he could dispose of the corpses at his leisure. The furnace in the basement was not a glass-bending furnace. It was a furnace for cremating bodies. The hotel's soundproof rooms with the peepholes and the secret gas piping that led directly into them meant that he could gas his victims and watch them slowly die in agony while no one could hear their screams and cries for help. And in one room, investigators discovered a blood-soaked wooden dissection table, along with women's bloody clothes and undergarments, and a bag of the doctor's lethal surgical tools. It was here, on that dissection table, that Dr. Holmes had taken Julia Connor late on Christmas Eve in 1891. She was pregnant with Dr. Holmes's baby, and the specific condition for marriage that Dr. Holmes had required that Julia had agreed to was that Julia would get an abortion performed by Dr. Holmes himself. But after Julia climbed up on that table to have this operation done, the doctor just began stabbing and slicing her. After he killed Julia and then went upstairs and promptly killed her 8-year-old daughter Pearl, it's believed Dr. Holmes then stripped all the flesh from their bones and sold their skeletons to a nearby medical school. As for Emmeline Cigrand, instead of marrying his young assistant as promised on those afternoons they spent at the World's Fair, he lured her inside of the walk-in vault in his office and then shut and locked the door behind her. For a while, Dr. Holmes just allowed himself to enjoy the sound of her sobs and cries for help in the airless, soundproof chamber. But once those delicious noises began to ebb, he turned on the gas that led into the vault. Police would discover a print of Emmeline's foot stamped into the door of the vault where, in her final moments, she had pressed with all of her might to try to force the door open. At Dr. Holmes's trial for the murder of Benjamin and the 3 Pitezel children, Dr. Holmes's wife, Georgiana Yoke, was shocked for a lot of reasons, but she was especially shocked to discover that she was actually one of 3 women, all married to the same man, Dr. Holmes. 3 living wives, that is. Dr. Holmes is also assumed to have killed one other woman who he married in order to inherit her deed to a valuable piece of land in Texas. As Dr. Holmes abandoned one wife after another without legally divorcing them, he also abandoned at least 2 legitimate children he had fathered. In April of 1896, convicted of murder, locked in prison, and facing the death penalty, Dr. Holmes confessed to having committed at least 27 murders. In his autobiography, Dr. Holmes wrote, quote, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than a poet can help the inspiration to sing." On May 7, 1896, Dr. Holmes stepped up onto the gallows at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. After kneeling down and murmuring a prayer to himself, Dr. Holmes stood and the guards put a black cloth bag over his head and placed a noose around his neck. At 10:13 a.m., the trapdoor underneath Dr. Holmes's feet suddenly opened, and down he fell. It would take 15 minutes of violent squirming and jerking around before America's first serial killer was finally dead. In 2009, 15-year-old Christina Grimmie finally caved and made her own YouTube channel. For years, her friends and family had been begging her to do this because Christina had this incredible singing voice that they wanted the world to hear, but Christina had always been hesitant because she was a bit of an introvert. But that year, Christina was feeling more outgoing, and so she took the plunge, she makes this channel, and in July of that year, she uploads her first 2 songs. They were both cover songs, and she was really proud of them, but when she uploaded them, they didn't get very many views. And so Christina probably was not very excited about making more videos. But a month later, she found herself really enjoying the song Party in the USA by Miley Cyrus, and so she was singing it all the time and humming it all the time, and so finally she said, okay, I'll just film myself covering that song. So she records herself singing this song, she uploads it to her YouTube channel, her 3rd video, and she thinks no one's going to see it because her first 2 videos no one really saw. But this video is different. It went viral almost immediately, and millions of people saw it, and they loved it. Christina couldn't believe it, even though her friends and family had been telling her all along, you have this great voice, you got to share it with the world. That's different than actually seeing the results of the world saying, you're really great, we love your voice. And so she saw this huge opportunity and she began uploading more and more music to her channel, and more of her videos went viral. Over the next 4 years, she amassed over 2 million subscribers on her YouTube channel, she put out her own album, and she even went on tour with the mega celebrity pop star Selena Gomez. In 2014, Christina auditioned for the TV singing competition called The Voice. This show only allows a very small number of contestants who are all incredibly talented musicians. They get screened really aggressively before the competition even starts. But despite the very intense competition she was up against, Christina still managed to finish third overall in this competition. Now, she might have been a little bit let down that she didn't finish first, but that show did wonders for her career, because the judges of this competition were mega celebrity musicians, and every time Christina was on TV doing her performance for the competition, the judges would be raving about how talented she was, and that even if she doesn't win this competition, someone's going to sign her. She's so incredible. And then sure enough, shortly after that competition ended, Christina was signed to a major record label. But despite being considered a star by the masses, Christina still very much viewed herself as being a YouTuber first, which meant despite her mainstream popularity and fame, she continued to upload songs and vlogs to her YouTube channel because she wanted to stay connected to her fans. YouTubers often upload videos that appear very amateur, like not professionally produced. It almost looks like anybody could have picked up their phone and filmed that video. And YouTubers tend to be very candid and show their personality in their videos. And so it makes YouTubers, especially these really popular ones, seem very real and raw and relatable. Unlike traditional celebrities that are kind of outside of society, living in their mansions, living a totally elite and different lifestyle, YouTubers feel like they're your friends. And this was definitely the case with Christina. On her videos, she came off as very humble and gracious and kind and friendly, and so her fans truly adored her. By June of 2016, Christina was still growing in popularity when she was asked to be the opening act for this concert in Orlando, Florida that was happening later that month. She agreed, and then on the day of the concert, which was June 10th, she posted to her social media this kind of shout out to all of her fans saying, hey, if you're in the Orlando, Florida area, come out to my show. And then after the show, I'm going to stick around and sign autographs and meet you guys. That night, the venue where this concert was happening was jam-packed, and most of the people were there for Christina, not the main act. And so Christina, she goes on stage, she has this incredible performance, the main act goes on stage, and then around 10 p.m., the concert ends, at which point Christina comes back out from behind stage and went right out into the crowd and began meeting her fans and hugging them and signing autographs and taking pictures. And then at 10:24 p.m., a man who was a fan of Christina's walked down from the back of the venue and kind of awkwardly gestured that he kind of wanted to get a hug. And Christina saw that, and so she smiled and she walked up to him. She opened her arms to give him a big hug. And when she got just a couple of feet away from him, he drew a pistol and he fired 4 shots into her head and into her body. Christina's brother, Mark, he was standing right nearby and he saw the attack. And so he tackled the shooter and he was trying to get control of this guy. But at some point, the shooter managed to wriggle free. And then he stood up and he kind of walked backwards until he was literally up against this wall, looking at the sea of people that are totally horrified. People are screaming and running and no one knows what he's going to do next. And then the shooter just raises the gun, puts it to his head and pulls the trigger. There were people in the audience who were medically trained who rushed over to Christina and they began performing CPR on her, but there really wasn't anything anyone could do. She would die that night at the hospital. Her killer was a 27-year-old man named Kevin Loibel. He, like many people, had become a Christina superfan, but his infatuation with her became a totally unhealthy obsession. And when it eventually dawned on him that he most likely would never have a romantic relationship with Christina, he came to the conclusion that if I can't have her, no one can have her. And so when Christina put that post out on social media asking people to come to Orlando to see her show and meet her after the show, he took that as an opportunity to go kill her. And so he lived in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is 120 miles away. And so he sees this post on social media. He grabs his 2 pistols, some extra ammunition. He gets a large hunting knife, and then he calls a cab. The cab drives him 120 miles northeast to Orlando, Florida. And then he gets into the venue with his weaponry because there weren't metal detectors and no one was frisking people as they came inside. And so he was in the back of the venue during the show. And then when it was over, he kind of lingered back, allowing other fans to go up and, kind of mob Christina. And then when there was a lull and there were less people down there with her, he strode right down the aisle and he ended her life. Our next story is called Facebook Post. Chad Lawhorn woke up in his Nashville home around 3 a.m. on April 8, 2018. He had taken a long flight back from San Francisco the night before, so his sleep schedule was all messed up. Not feeling very tired, he decided to go downstairs to the kitchen to get a snack. And as he was walking down the stairs, he pulled out his phone and he saw a notification from his Venmo account. His younger brother Casey had sent him $250, and attached to it was a single-word note. It just said, "Damages." Knowing his brother had long struggled with his mental health, Chad was concerned he was getting ready to hurt himself, and he had sent him this money as a way to compensate for the emotional toll he was about to inflict on him. Chad didn't even change out of his pajamas. He grabbed his keys, hopped in his car, and began driving the 2 hours to East Ridge, Tennessee, where his younger brother and his mother lived. On the ride there, he called both of them dozens of times, but he never got through. When he finally pulled onto their street, he looked down the road and he saw dozens of police cars and TV crews, and there was yellow crime scene tape all around their property. Chad just stopped the car right in the middle of the road and just stared. And he didn't know how long he was there for, but at some point one of the police officers noticed him and walked up and knocked on his window. And when the officer found out who he was talking to, the news Chad was delivered was far worse than anything he was expecting. 24 hours earlier, Chad's younger brother, Casey, who was 23, was spending the day with one of his very good friends named Avery. They had gone to a comic book store to play Magic the Gathering, and then afterwards they headed back to Casey's house to go to bed. Around 12:30 in the morning, Avery fell asleep on the living room floor, and as Casey was getting ready to go to bed himself, his mother called him and asked if he could come pick her up at the bar. And so Casey begrudgingly agreed to do it. He drove to pick her up, and when he saw her, he could tell she was totally intoxicated. And the entire ride home, she just pleaded with Casey not to hurt himself because it would totally devastate her if he ever did that. Casey hated when she talked to him that way, and apparently she did this all the time. When they got back to the house, Casey dropped his mom off, and then he went up to his bedroom where he retrieved a rifle he had stolen from a friend. And then he paced around his room for a while, getting mentally prepared for what he was about to do. And when he felt ready, he left his room, he went downstairs to the living room where Avery was still asleep on the ground, and he placed the rifle up against the side of his head, and he fired one shot, killing his friend instantly. Once he was dead, Casey went upstairs to his mother's room. When he got to the threshold of her room, he pushed the door open and it was totally dark, but he could tell his mother was still awake in her bed. He raised his rifle and he fired, except the gun didn't go off, it jammed. His mother, because she was so intoxicated, did not hear the shot ring out, and she didn't really know what her son was doing in the doorway, so she did not raise any alarms. And so Casey just turned around, walked into the hallway where there was light, he fixed the jam in his gun, he turned back around, and this time his mother was now out of bed because the family dog was barking like mad, and so his mother was trying to calm the dog down, and she looked up and saw her son standing in the doorway carrying a gun, and so she just kind of froze and stared at him. And that's when Casey, without any hesitation, raises his rifle and fires 2 shots, and then his gun jams again. Now, neither of those 2 shots were fatal, although one of them did strike her in the arm. And even though she was intoxicated, she was now fully aware her son is trying to kill her. And so she's screaming at him, "Why are you doing this? You're killing me!" Casey was totally unfazed. He flipped on the lights, he fixed the jam, he re-aimed at his mother, and his mother, who was still just standing next to the bed, looking at her son, wondering why this was happening, and Casey just aimed and took 2 shots, and these would be fatal. After that, he went downstairs and robbed Avery, and then he hopped in his car and he drove all the way to Mississippi, where within 24 hours, he would take his own life. We know all of these details because shortly after he committed these crimes, Casey posted a lengthy confession to Facebook detailing exactly what happened and what he did. In his post, Casey says he feels extremely bad for his older brother Chad because he knows this is going to be extremely hard for him, and he encourages people to help his brother during this insanely difficult time. While he doesn't provide a specific motive for why he committed these crimes, he does say at the end of his confession that he's been thinking about murder a lot lately and wanted to know how it felt. But after doing it, he says he barely felt anything at all. The next and final story of today's episode is called Murder Mystery Murder. A little after noon on Valentine's Day 1998, a married couple named Steve and Kim Rico held hands as they walked towards their car. They had just dropped their 8-year-old daughter off at a neighbor's house in the suburban neighborhood in Maryland where they lived, and now Steve and Kim had the whole weekend to themselves. And they were really excited about it because they had this big trip planned. Now, admittedly, Kim had no idea what they were actually going to be doing because Steve was the one who planned it, and he was obviously being very secretive about the details. He wanted this to be a surprise. And so for weeks leading up to this weekend, Kim would see Steve on the phone all the time, presumably planning whatever it is they were going to be doing, but he wouldn't let Kim hear what he was saying on the phone. He would kind of muffle his voice, or he'd hang up before she could come over and hear him. And then also after these secretive phone calls, Kim would often see Steve writing all these notes down in his journal, presumably about whatever it was he was planning. The only details Steve shared with Kim about this trip was, make sure you wear something nice. When the couple reached their car, Steve hopped in the driver's seat and Kim hopped in the passenger seat, and immediately right after Steve had fired up the car, Kim turned to him and said, "Are you going to tell me? You going to tell me where we're going?" But Steve just grinned and said, "Nope, it's a surprise." Kim gave a theatrical sigh and sat back and feigned frustration, but inside, the way she was really feeling was just excited. This was so cool that Steve had put so much effort into whatever it is they were going to do. But also, Kim was seeing her husband was really making a big effort to make her happy. And this was kind of new because lately their relationship had been really rocky. Kim and Steve had been married for 9 years by this point, and they were both very, very different people. Steve was a total homebody, kind of introverted, and Kim was the opposite. She was super extroverted and very social. But when they first met each other, it was actually their stark differences that brought them together. For Kim, when they met, she was in her early 20s, she had just dropped out of college, and her experience with men so far had been she would meet them at parties or bars, and at first it would seem like their relationship was great, but then invariably these guys would just kind of move on and break Kim's heart. But Steve was different. He was this huge guy, 6'4", massive football player, but he was totally a gentle giant, and as soon as he met Kim, Kim could tell this guy is different. He's treating her with respect. He's loyal to her. He really cares about her. And so they hit it off right away. And Kim very quickly became pregnant, at which point Steve asked her to marry him, and Kim didn't hesitate for a second. They were totally in love. And marriage to Steve had really been a stabilizing factor in Kim's life. She wound up going back to college and got her degree, which landed her a job as a surgical technician, which is what she did now. And Steve turned out to be just a fantastic father, and he wound up actually staying home with their daughter when she was a baby so Kim could go out and work. And Kim always thought it was funny when she would come home and she would see Steve standing in the doorway cradling this infant, but he's like this massive person, and so their baby looked like a toy. But unfortunately, over the last year, Kim had seen a change in Steve. He went from being a shy person, but a person who could go out and function in society, to a shy person who basically stopped going outside altogether. Steve basically refused to go out anywhere with Kim. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He didn't want to spend time with their friends or family. He just wanted to stay home and watch TV or hang out in the basement. I mean, it was pretty obvious he was depressed, but his introvertedness was becoming kind of stifling for Kim. And so Kim approached Steve and said, "You really need to go to therapy to get better here. I'll go with you. We can do couples therapy." But Steve refused. And so finally, right around this past New Year, Kim decided she had just had enough. She was totally unhappy. She did not feel like Steve was going to change. And so Kim told Steve that she wanted to get divorced. And when Steve heard that, he realized the gravity of this situation. He knew Kim was unhappy with him, but he did not know she was thinking about separating. And so Steve kind of broke down and begged Kim to give him another chance. Let him prove to her that he will change, that he wants this marriage to work. And Kim said, okay. And so that was how Steve wound up planning this very secret getaway on Valentine's Day. This trip was supposed to be the start of their new and improved marriage, and so Kim was really excited and optimistic about the future. After driving for about an hour and a half, Steve pulled off the highway and began following signs towards the Eastern Shore, which is a waterfront area of Maryland that's very beautiful, that was located about 70 miles away from Steve and Kim's home. After driving for a few minutes, Steve pulled into the parking lot of the Harbortown Golf Resort. And as soon as he pulled into a spot and turned off the car, he clapped his hands and turned to Kim and said, "Okay, we're here." And Kim looked from her husband out to all the perfectly manicured grounds and the beautiful resort, and she smiled and leapt out of the car excitedly. Kim and Steve took each other's hands and marched inside to check in. And as they were checking in, the person behind the desk gave them glasses of champagne. And then after handing Kim and Steve their key cards, the receptionist told them that their cottage where they were staying was like the nicest property at the resort. Kim and Steve were totally pumped. They took their champagne and their room keys, they walked back to their car, and then drove a little ways deeper into the resort to their cottage. It was cottage 506, and it looked out over the water. And when they went inside, Kim was totally wowed. It was this rustic suite with a wood fire stove in the middle and 2 queen-size beds, and a little coffee table area for breakfast over here. It was perfect. And then when Kim actually walked into this cottage, she noticed there was a card sitting on a table, and it looked like a wedding invitation. Kim was confused and looked over at Steve, and Steve just smiled and said, "Go, check it out." And so Kim walked over and she grabbed the note and she began reading it, and as she did, she began to smile. The card really was a wedding invitation, albeit it was for a fake wedding. Because it would turn out, this was not just a random overnight that Steve had planned for both of them. Instead, he had purchased a romantic getaway package, which included this amazing cottage, but also a professional dinner theater performance that would be held on the resort grounds. Kim read the description of the dinner theater show on this invitation. It was a murder mystery called The Bride Who Cried, where the actors in the show would put on a whole fake wedding, and then at the end of the wedding, somebody would get killed, and the audience would need to figure out who did it. For an extrovert like Kim, an activity like this was perfect. And so Kim felt totally touched that clearly Steve had heard her, and the first thing he did to kind of win her back was to begin to do the things that Kim really wanted to do, which was really going out and having fun. And so after Kim finished reading the card, she turned and looked over at Steve, and Steve was kind of nervous because he wasn't sure if Kim was going to like it. And Kim, she broke into this huge smile. She walked over to Steve and gave him a big hug. And Steve, he was so happy, and he hugged her real tight right back. Kim and Steve would spend the next couple of hours sitting by their fire inside of their nice cottage, drinking their champagne and talking about the future and just telling stories and having a good time. And then around 7 p.m., Steve and Kim put on their nicest clothes and walked their way over to the area on the resort where this dinner theater was going to happen. It was in an event hall with a bunch of round tables set up for the audience. And so once Steve and Kim and the other audience members all took their seats, the actors and actresses came into the room, and they were all dressed in their wedding clothes. There was a bride and a groom and a wedding party, and the audience was instructed to participate in the wedding as if they were wedding guests. And so the audience all stood up and they began kind of having this fake social hour of meeting all the wedding guests. And then Steve, Kim, and the audience members all took their seats and they got ready to watch the drama unfold. And Kim pretty much immediately was totally absorbed in this performance. She was so enthusiastic, talking to the actors and talking to the other guests and really pretending like she was part of the wedding. I mean, she was having a blast. The play itself was about a groom who was in the mafia, who was forcing his bride to marry him by threatening her family. The climax came when the groom stood up and gave a toast with his champagne. He took a sip, and then fell down dead. Kim watched all of this with delight, but she kept looking over at Steve, hoping he too would be smiling and having a good time. But each time she looked at him, he was just kind of stone-faced and looking straight ahead, like he just didn't care or he was totally disinterested. And then a couple of times when Kim leaned over and said, "Hey, honey, who do you think did it? Who do you think the killer is?" Steve basically just completely ignored her. It was like she wasn't there and the play wasn't there. He was just totally zoned out. Eventually, Kim and a few other very enthusiastic audience members figured out the killer in the play was the bride's mother, who poisoned the groom. And then after this discovery was made, the play was over. As everyone got up from their seats and began to leave, Kim couldn't help but feel really annoyed with Steve because he was just so silent and not invested in this play. And it's like, we came all the way here. Why aren't you at least pretending to enjoy this? But Kim also thought, Steve put a ton of effort into this weekend. He's clearly trying. I'm not going to start a fight. I'm not going to bring it up. And so finally, Kim just said to Steve, "Hey, why don't we go to the bar and get a couple of drinks, bring them back to our cottage, and just hang out there for the night?" And when Steve heard this, he actually smiled and said, "Okay, great, let's do it." And by the time the couple got back to the front door of cottage 506, they were holding hands again and laughing and telling stories. And they went inside and Steve put the beers down on the table. And then Kim said she was going to go in the bedroom and just quickly change into something more comfortable. And so Kim walked into the bedroom and shut the door, and Steve walked to the front door and turned the lock. Three hours later, a man named Philip Parker, who was staying at the resort with his family, heard a commotion in the lobby. And he heard people saying there might be a fire at cottage 506 and there could be somebody still inside. Philip immediately turned to his cousin who was with him, and the two of them bolted outside and just started running towards cottage 506. And as soon as they got to a place where they could see the cottage from a distance, they could see black, oily smoke pouring out of the windows. When they got up to the burning cottage, Philip ran to the front door, but it was locked. He couldn't get inside. He screamed to see if anybody was in there, but there was no answer. And so Philip and the cousin ran around to the back of the cottage where there was a glass sliding door. And Philip, he tried the handle, but it was locked. At this point, the cousin said he was going to run back to the resort and get a fire extinguisher. And after the cousin ran off, Philip turned back towards the sliding glass door and realized it actually opened on both ends. And he had only checked one side and found that side to be locked. But on the other side, which he was now noticing, it was obviously unlocked because it was open just barely. And so Philip immediately opened it up and all the smoke began coming out. And so Philip dropped down to get a better look because down low, the smoke had not fully settled. There was a bit of an air pocket right at the bottom of the floor. And so Philip got down and he looked inside, and for a second he couldn't quite see anything. But then he noticed in the middle of the bedroom, right inside this cottage, he could clearly see somebody's feet. Somebody was on the ground. And so Philip screamed that he was coming in, and then he opened the door the rest of the way and he began low crawling into the bedroom. And as he did, he was hacking and coughing from all the smoke. And so finally Philip reached this person and he grabbed their foot and he shook them to try to wake them up, but they weren't moving. But the fire was getting bigger and stronger. The smoke was getting thicker. Philip was really starting to panic and was worried that he too would get trapped in here. And so he just grabbed this person's leg and began pulling them. And it was really hard, but he finally got this person back to the door. He couldn't quite get them over that lip of where the sliding door was. But right then, Philip's cousin showed up and the two of them were able to grab this person and get them out of the cottage. And this was the moment when Philip finally got a look at the person he was just dragging out. And it was immediately clear to him that this person was deceased. Their face was basically gone. It was completely burned away. In the days and weeks leading up to this weekend, Steve really was taking secret phone calls and writing notes down in his journal because he was planning something very special. But he was not the only one with plans for this weekend. Here's what police say happened after Kim and Steve got back to their cottage following the show, and Kim went into the bedroom to change, and Steve went to the front door and locked it. A couple of minutes later, Kim came out of the bedroom wearing something sexy, and she looked at Steve and smiled and said, "Come on, get in bed. I'll join you in a second." And so Steve's like, "Great, my plan is working. We're going to reconnect here." He climbed in bed and he laid down. Then Kim, she walked over and got something out of her bag. And then she walked back over to the bed and she pulled out a syringe and she stabbed it into Steve before he could do anything. And she injected him with something called succinylcholine. Kim had access to this drug from her job as a surgical tech. Succinylcholine is used to relax people's muscles during surgery. But if you give someone too big a dose, it can stop their breathing. And this drug works pretty much instantly, which means Steve would have seen his wife stab him with that syringe, but then instantly he would have been totally paralyzed, but fully awake and fully alive. And so as he was laying there, he would have seen his wife put the syringe down and then grabbed lighter fluid and then walked over to him and calmly poured the lighter fluid all over Steve's face and chest. And then one of Steve's final images he likely saw before his lungs stopped working and he died was his wife striking a match and lighting him on fire. After lighting Steve on fire, Kim casually walked out the backsliding door. She shut it, leaving it open just a crack, and then she made her way to the resort lobby where she put on this big act about how her cottage was on fire and she thinks her husband was still inside. And Philip overheard Kim say that her husband might be inside the cottage, which is when he and his cousin jumped into action. They ran to the cottage and ultimately found Steve deceased inside of the cottage. Ultimately, Kim never intended to give Steve a second chance in their marriage. She was already having an affair with a much younger man who was in the Marines, and she was just done with Steve. And so as Steve began telling his friends and family how he was going to make a huge effort to save his marriage, Kim was going around to her friends and literally openly talking about how she wanted to murder her husband. But nobody took her seriously. They thought she was just kind of venting and being kind of dramatic. But as soon as the news broke that Steve had died in this fire and Kim had not, people rushed to the police to tell them, pretty sure Kim had something to do with this. Kim was convicted of her husband's murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. It would turn out the primary reason why Steve was so secretive before going on this trip was he really wanted it to be this unbelievably special, romantic, kind of like recreation of the couple's first date. And so what he was doing is he was calling all of Kim's friends and family members and asking them questions about things Kim liked because he wanted to incorporate all of her interests in this trip. And then after these calls, when Steve was writing in his journal, that was not just writing down like logistics of the trip. He was also writing down how much he loved Kim and how excited he was for their future and what they would build together as a family. I mean, Steve really believed they were on a path to reconciliation, but of course, that just was not the case. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the Mr. Ballin podcast, and also Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows.